happenings in Medfield. This evening is a special meeting in one respect. Our guest needs really no introduction, Richard DeSorgher's. As you know, Richard has put out quite a book. And so I have had comments about that book by many people. But when you're doing a program for a half hour, you can cover just so much. And so this is our second segment of one fine book with a tremendous amount of history. And so, in turn, it's always my pleasure, because as you know, Richard DeSorgher's, being a selectman, also town historian, he's very knowledgeable in the happenings. And so, it's always my pleasure to welcome Richard DeSorgher's. Richard?
Jack, welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
You're more than welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, this is the second segment. Let's start from there, and it's up to you.
Well, I just thought we'd cover some of the things that we didn't cover the first time that are in the book. As you know, I write actually I'm going on 10 years now, writing the weekly article in Hometown Weekly that I called This Old Town, that different aspects of Medfield's history. And what I did is to put what I thought the first 74 interesting articles in the book that's called This Old Town, Remembering Medfield, and through the generosity of the Medfield Historical Society and their wealth of photos that they have in the files, each of the stories I'm able to put some great photographs of Medfield of yesteryear. And so what I thought I would do today is some of the stories we didn't get to last time, maybe talk about some of them. And being summer and being so hot and humid out today, I thought maybe we'd start with a couple of the stories that are in there. One is called Lazy Days of Summer, and the other deals with the Hinckley Swim Pond, and look at, what was Medfield like in the summer back, in the 1800s, early 1900s. Today, many people leave Medfield in the summer. The blessing is you can actually sometimes cross 109 without waiting for 20 minutes, and the traffic gets a little better in the downtown. But if we were in Medfield back in the 1800s, if you know where Causeway Street is going towards Noon Hill, right along the Charles River, was a spot that became known as Clark's Camp. And this guy, Joseph Clark, back in the 1880s, actually maybe a little bit ahead of his time, thinking it's good health, good exercise to be outdoors. He decided that in the land he had down there, he was going to camp out there with his family for the summer. And they would use the Charles River for swimming, for boating, and pretty soon other relatives began to follow him. And the following year, more relatives came, and a couple actually built some crude wooden structures that they could stay in for camps that were down there. And over the following years, other people, neighbors, other people began to come down to that area on both the Medfield side of the Charles River and on the Miller side. Now, we still have today, and there's probably not many people in town that realize, we have what's called Dwight Street. And if you were going down Causeway Street, over Stop River, the first right is actually Dwight Street. And if you did that today, you'd say, wait a minute, I don't even see a street, because it's totally overgrown. There's a little small path that meanders down to the river. But if you actually use your foot or dig that up a little bit, you'd actually come to the tar that's still there. And Dwight Street used to go down to the Charles River, over the Charles River, continue into Millis, where it still does today, and it comes up on 109, the very top of the hill, into Millis. In 1936, we had this huge flood, and it washed the Dwight Street Bridge out, and Medfield never rebuilt the bridge. And so since 1936, it was basically a short cul-de-sac or dead end, and then eventually it's become overgrown. But back in the 1880s, on that bridge, they actually put a diving board. And people would dive off, and you'd be swimming there, and it became like a social summer spot. and they built a music hall that was there. They had hen house. They had the milkman, the iceman, the butcher would come down there. Everyone would gather. It was a social event, and there were numerous families that were down there in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they would stay right until September, until the weather began to get cold, and then they'd go back to their house in the village in Medfield, which was probably about a mile or two away. And then some of the kids, if the weather was good in September, actually would walk to school from there. So we had kind of that was the swimming area, the summer vacation spot, even though it was still in Medfield, in that area known as Clark's Camp. So that probably is the first kind of resort for the lazy days of summer. And then coming up in a little more modern time into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, Kingsbury Pond actually was the main swimming area in Medfield. If you know where the grist mill is, a little ways down, you can still see where the area had been cleared out, but they would put sand in there each year. They have a nice sandy beach that was there. They had a little raft about halfway between the island and the shore, and they would have free swim there for the Medfield populace, and you would have a lifeguard that was there. Edie O'Toole, a longtime resident here in Medfield, told me a great story that I mentioned in the book, that we actually invited some of the Millis kids over as well to do a swimming competition with the Medfield kids that were there. Swimming instruction in later years was held there. And so from the 30s to the 50s, that was kind of Medfield's swim hole or swimming area that was there. And they would tell stories that they would get leeches and bloodsuckers and stuff on them when they were out swimming into the pond. That was always a classic. But by the 1950s, Medfield's population was growing, and Kingsbury just became too small. Plus, it wasn't town-owned. It was privately owned, and the town had to reach an agreement. And the owner, by the 1950s, said, this is getting too large. So Medfield lost its swimming area. And then, as I mentioned in the book, from the 50s into the 60s, Medfield families would either go over to Farm Pond in Millis, New Pond over in Norwood, or even over to Lake Massapog over in Sharon, because there was no swimming facility. And so the town formed a swim pond committee by vote of town meeting to look around town what we could do for a swimming facility. And that area of Green Street, bordered by Brook Street and Green Street, was actually used by the town water department as where we got our water supply from. That's all fresh springs that are in there. And in 1962, we officially opened up what became, at the time, was called the Medfield Swim Pond. And it's amazing, and I mentioned some of the statistics into the book, that the first full year, actually 1963 that it was open, the pond had 3,300 members.
Wow.
In the pond. Now I think today they have about just under 300 families, but back then there were 3,300 members. That first year they gave 800 kids swimming lessons. And in the Greater Boston Red Cross, Medfield had the highest number of kids awarded certificates to learn how to swim than any other area in the Greater Boston Red Cross. So it was a very popular place. And there's a great story I mentioned in the book, Gretchen Schultz. Now, Gretchen Schultz did not know how to swim when she was a young kid, and she went through the entire swimming lessons each year at the swim pond, and then later actually became one of the lifeguards at the pond. So she just was a great case of the advantage we have of learning how to swim and that facility at Hinkley Pond. So it's been there since 1962, still going strong. That's down there. So I do talk about those three different areas, the Clark's Camp, Kingsbury's Pond, and now Hinkley Pond. And then I get into, I didn't mention last time, I have a whole segment that deals with the schools in Medfield.
Very important.
And one is called Back to School, the early years, and another chapter is called Back to School, the latter years. And where Zebras is today was the original site of the first schoolhouse in Medfield that dated from 1666. So, you know, education is very important up here in New England. We officially become a town in 1651, and by 1666, you know, we have an education system here in Medfield to educate the kids. And as I mentioned in the book, if you had a population, once your population got larger, you had to have a secondary school to teach for anyone wanting to go to the college. And the college, of course, is Harvard, which was the only college at the time. Just an aside, just a funny story. When I was still teaching, we were talking about this, and I said to my class, I said, you know, and they had to teach people to go to the college. I said, does anybody know what the college is? Kid raises his hand and says, BC. I said, oh, no, it was Harvard. And of course, the reason you went to school back then was to become a minister. Oh. And so I talk a little bit about that very first school. There were 4 schools built on that site where Zebras is today. In fact, if you go into Zebras, as you're walking in on the ground, there is a plaque that the Historical Society put there many, many years ago that says, site of the first schoolhouse, 1666. And what's interesting, in 1732, Medfield adopts what's called the district school system. So that, you got to remember, everybody walked to school back then. And even though you think of Medfield as a small town, if you lived in the north end of town and the south end of town, you know, to walk, especially in the winter, would be quite a distance. So Medfield develops a north school, a center school, which was where Zebras is, and a south school. So we had 3 different school districts. And in 1732, we built our first north school and south school. And the north school first was located actually not too far where the FAF Center is today. That was the very first north school. And then they later moved that in, I think it was around 1799. They moved that to the intersection of Harding Street and North Street, and that became the second North School. And then they later moved it again down to the corner of North Street and White Street. And that later became known as the Lower Mason School. And that stayed as a school into the 1920s, when the town, by then, we had built the new school, and we did away with the, you know, the districts, no longer having a North School. But I actually talked to some people a number of years ago that actually went to that North School. George Hinckley, the father, actually had gone to the school. Was telling me some great stories about the North School. And then it later was privately purchased and then burnt down. So that's why some people say, why is that called School Street, right in the corner of School and North Street? I think I said White Street originally, which is further down. But it was actually in the corner of School and North Street, and it was called School Street because that's where the North School was. And then we had the South School, and that was right at the intersection of South Street and Harding Street. There were 4 of those schools. The 1851 actually burned to the ground. And that original 1792 school actually is still standing, and it's actually now a garage used on right in the corner of South Street and Juniper Lane, that house there. And it actually has the plaque still on it that makes note of the school. So there's some great stories in there about the North Schools, the South School. And then, as I said, where Zebras is today was the center school. And in the early, actually 1859, we built a new center school, and that's on 25 Pleasant Street. Some people may remember that had been here in town a while. That's where Dr. Stagg used to live. And we built the new center school there, and that school we later named the Ralph Wheelock School. That was the first Ralph Wheelock School. And the South School we named the Hannah Adams School, named after Hannah Adams, who was nationally known as the first female author to put her name on her work and actually get paid for her work. She was actually born down on Elm Street. So we had the 3 schools. The South School goes out of business around 1904, and that school was then also privately purchased and moved. And that was moved over to 15 High Street, where it is today. Somebody lives in there. There's also a plaque on that. So it's kind of interesting just on the early years of the education, the importance that it played. And then I have another chapter on the back to school, the latter years, and the Ralph Willock School, which was on Pleasant Street, in 1940, March of 1940, burns to the ground. And now suddenly Medfield only has one school, and that's what is today the Pfaff Center, which was built in 1927, and that became the high school. So you had all the elementary grades down on Pleasant Street, and you had the junior, senior grades 7 to 12 in the Pfaff Center. Now suddenly with the Wheelock School burned to the ground, they have to put all grades, believe it or not, into the Pfaff Center. So they had to put them on double sessions. So you had the elementary kids in one session, and then you had the junior, senior high school kids in the other session. And some great stories about that, just coming and goings in the double session. Medfield realized you can't keep doing the double sessions, and we had to build now a new school, and that is what is today the Dale Street School. And that begins just before the outbreak of World War II. In fact, the war, because we have scarcity of metals and other things, that slows down the construction. But by 1942, the Dale Street School opens up as the new Medfield High School. It was called the Hannah Adams Path High School because and I'm going to talk about her in a minute, Hannah Adams Path lived across the street, and she actually donated the land where the Dale Street School and the Pfaff Center are today to the town. And the one catch was, if you ever put a building on that, this was the son that donated the land. You have to name it after my mother, Hannah Adams Path. So that's why it's still called the Path Center. And many people don't realize, but the Dale Street School's official name is the Hannah Adams Path Elementary School. Even though it says Dale Street School, no one calls it that, but that's the official name of that school. According to the deed that we received that land for nothing, we agreed that we would name the building after Hannah Adams Path, who was the grandniece of the original Hannah Adams. So that's the tie to that. So now in 1942, we have the new high school built. As we get into the early 1950s, Medfield's population goes through the ceiling. At the end of World War II, under the GI Bill and others now, the World War II veterans from Boston and the urban areas come out to these small towns. And large numbers of families that they have, large numbers of children in those families, and suddenly there's a need for additional schools to be built. And Medfield clearly reflects that piece of the history, and I talk about that in the book. 1951, we have the Memorial School built, which is named in memory of all those who fought and died in World War II. And there's actually a great plaque in the front of that school that lists everybody from Medfield that served in World War II, and then a special memorial above that of those that were killed in World War II from Medfield. So now in 1951, we have a new elementary school. And then by 1956, the population, even though the school was less than 5 years old, is overcrowded. And now we add the addition on, we add 13 new classrooms onto that. And now by 1961, the three schools are overcrowded again. And that's when we make the decision to build a new high school over here on Pound Street, on 24 Pound Street. And there's another great story with that, because that Medfield High School is officially known as Amos Clark Kingsbury High School. I don't know anybody that refers to it as that. Everybody says Medfield High School, although on their diplomas it says Amos Clark Kingsbury High School on that. And the reason for that is the land where we're sitting now in the studio, and also where what is now the Blake Middle School, which in 1961 was built as Medfield High School. All this land was originally owned by the Marchionettes that lived out on Pound Street. And Blanche Marchionette had just married Amos Clark Kingsbury, and 6 months later he dies. And so she offers the town this land with the stipulation if the town would agree to name the new high school after her husband. And the town thought about 30 seconds. They were getting a great deal, and they agreed, and that's why the high school is officially called Amos Clark Kingsbury High School. And so next door to where we're sitting here in the studio, that opens up as the new Medfield High School. Actually, it opened up as the junior-senior high school, grades 7 to 12. And again, with the massive increase in population, 5 years later, by 1966, 1967, we build the building we're sitting in right now. And this became Medfield Junior High School. And then by 1969, less than 3 years later, we have to build another elementary school, and that's the current, was originally called the Elm Street School, and now it's the new Ralph Wheelock School. So that, I kind of give people the puzzle of how we get the different schools, here in Medfield. So that's a little bit on the education. Maybe just one other thing, I have a chapter here. I don't know if you realize, you've read the book, so you do know that, but we have a chapter here on Medfield High School is actually abolished. We did away with Medfield High School. And in 1903, because the town's population was so small back then, that the new superintendent thought that the high school kids could get a better education if they went to a larger town, because they would have the resources and the money to offer more than Medfield. There was only 40 kids in the entire high school, so it was very small. So in 1903, we closed Medfield High School, which was then over on Pleasant Street, the Ralph Wheelock School, and we had 26 kids in the high school that decided to continue. 14 of them we sent to Dedham High School. 12 of them we sent to Walpole High School. We gave the town supplied each kid with a dime so they could ride the train. They'd get on the train station, which was on Park Street, and they would ride to school and back and forth, the 10-cent round trip. And in 1903, we sent all our kids to either Dedham or Walpole. Now, the following year, in 1904, and from what I read in the newspaper accounts, it said a little bit of town pride because we lost our high school. The town voted to bring back a 2-year high school. So we'd do the first 2 grades, but then the junior-senior year, they continued to go to Walpole or Dedham. And then that stayed that way in 1904 and 1905. In 1906, we added a 3rd year, with the seniors still going over to Walpole and Dedham. And then in 1907, 1908 school year, we brought back the 4-year high school, and we've been 4 years ever since. And by that time, as I said, the population of the high school reached 43, up from the 26 it had been in 1903. So a little bit, I tell a little bit about the high school being abolished. Let me jump. I don't think I talked last time. I have a chapter here called War, Jitterbug, and a New School, Medfield in the 1940s, and kind of talk about what was going on in Medfield in relation to what was going on in the United States in the 1940s. And I mentioned before we built the new school when the Wheelock School had burned. It's interesting, the politics. Medfield was a bedrock Republican community, actually, as was Massachusetts in the 1930s and 1940s. And it seems funny saying that today because Massachusetts is such a Democratic state. But I'll just give you the election results when Wendell Willkie ran against FDR. Willkie carried Medfield more than 2-1, getting 836 votes to FDR's 407. So we're a very strong Republican community here. The school system was so small that the football team, we had to go to a 6-man football league because we didn't have the 11 people to play. So we read that. I wanted to read a little bit of the police log, which I thought was great. I talk about in here. What was crime like in Medfield?
That'd be interesting.
In the 1940s, and here's a little bit of the police log, and it says during During the year 1940, Medfield police arrested 6 people during the year for operating under the influence of liquor. They investigated 6 cases of breaking and entering. They arrested 1 person for illegal entry into the United States. They arrested 1 person for polygamy. 42 inmates escaped from Medfield State Hospital. 2 automobiles were stolen. 2 pigs were picked up by the police and put in the town pound. 18 streetlights were broken by rocks. 1 goat was killed on the highway. 12 hens were stolen, and 1 person was treated for a gunshot wound. Housed in Medfield in 1940, there were 349 cattle, 15 sheep, 574 pigs, and 26 goats. So we still have a little bit of a rural look into Medfield.
Very obvious.
As we get to 1940. We also talked about in the chapter, and you'll clearly remember, I'm sure, but when Pearl Harbor happened,
Yeah.
a lot of kids that were in high school left high school.
Right.
And many of them either lied about their age because they wanted to go in, or disguised their age and went in actually under age 18. And we talk about a number of Medfield kids that left high school, never graduated from Medfield High School, and went off into the war. And I think I mentioned last time, we later were able to have those veterans that never received their Medfield High School diploma actually graduate with the Medfield High School class and get their diplomas.
Bill Kelly.
Bill Kelly was one of them.
One of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I mentioned in the book, and I just want to repeat, you say a lot, least we forget. But a number of those Medfield boys never came back because they were
Very
killed.
true.
And the Committee to Study Memorials, I think, has done a real good job of trying to make sure we have a street or a square named after anyone that was killed in war. And we have every one so far but one of World War II. And I just want to mention, because I think it's important we don't forget, we have Vincent Bravo, we have Bravo Square, which is down on the intersection of 109 and 27. John Crowder, Thomas Clues, and Joseph Pace. Joseph Pace, I talked about last time, was killed at Pearl Harbor.
Right.
We have the streets off of Dale Street named after them. Auckland Kinnear, I mentioned him last time also, was actually killed before Pearl Harbor. He was up in the undeclared war that we were having up in the North Atlantic,
Right.
tracking the German subs and others. The intersection of Pine and North Street is named after him. Earl Lee, which we just dedicated officially, Lee Road here in Medfield with a new square. Medfield TV did a nice job filming that.
Yeah.
John Ross Jr., and that's the intersection of South and Main Street, is named after him. Robert Sproul, the road right behind us off of Pound Street, is named after him. And Richard Werner, the intersection of Harding Street and West Mill Street, is named after him. The only one we've yet to name is Douglas McKeechee. He lived down on Elm Street, so we're working to get a square. But they're mentioned in my book, as well. Yeah. Maybe one, before I leave the schools and stuff, just to mention quickly, I have a chapter in there called Winners Never Quit and Quitters Never Win. And it's a great story about the year 1953, and the football coach at the time, a guy by the name of Charlie Maines. And Charlie Maines went on to become the principal of Medfield High School until his retirement. And when he left Medfield in 1970, actually went down to a school down in Long Island. But I talk about in the chapter the 1953 football team, which ended up 7-1-0. Again, we're very small schools, so we were using 7th and 8th graders in that, but just a tremendous team that played that year. And I just want to mention the Thanksgiving game that Medfield ended up winning 7-6, and at the end, and we never beat Westwood. Westwood was always the Thanksgiving rival back then. And by beating Westwood, the town went berserk.
Yeah, they tore down
They tore down the goalpost. They had this caravan coming back into town. And Eric Onberg, who's the current football coach, did a nice job. Back a few years ago, he invited the surviving members of that 1953 team to the football banquet that they have.
That's something.
And we actually got a chunk of the goalpost that they had written all the scores on, and that now is in the trophy case of the high school. And they gave a nice honor to that 1953 team, and I talk about that chapter in the book. And there's a number of other sports-related. The 1961 Medfield lost 32 straight games. And in 1961, on Veterans Day, 1961, we beat East Bridgewater 14-12. And again, the town went berserk. They had this parade back to the high school, and I mentioned there, the fire department actually rang the fire whistles 14 times, then 12 times to signify the score that we won that time. I talk a lot about basketball becomes king here in Medfield in the 1970s, Big Blue, some great photos of some of the early teams and some of the scores. Girls basketball in 1973 wins 22 straight games. They're undefeated. They win the TVL. There's a great story in that with that. Depending upon what time I have, I thought I'd just talk about some of the different individual people that I have a chapter on.
If you would. We got them.
Well, one is Jacob Cushman, and there's actually a street off of in the Loeffler development named after Jacob Cushman. But he lived on North Street. His house is still standing. It's actually owned now by the Montrose School. And he sets up at the end of a Meeting House Pond or Baker's Pond a carriage making industry that's down there. And believe it or not, in that little area by Upham Road and around the corner where Medfield Day takes place, there were 5 buildings that were there, and they made wooden carriages that were there that were sold all over New England, all over the country. In fact, the butcher wagon was known for its high quality that was sold there. So a number of people were employed there with Jacob Cushman starting that. He ends up retiring in the 1880s. He goes into partnership with this Joseph Baker, which is one of the reasons that becomes known as Baker's Pond. Before, in 1976, in our bicentennial, we officially name a lot of places, including the pond. Officially becomes known as Meeting House Pond. So some great stories on Jacob Cushman and that early carriage making factory that's down there. I have another chapter on Jeremiah Hale and horrible childhood he goes through there. Brought up in Alabama, his siblings die, his mother dies. Finally, the father gets him back up here with relatives, which brings him back up into Medfield. He goes on to work in the hat factory. Now, last time I talked about the Mitchell or the Excelsior hat factory where the Montrose School is, but what that overshadows, Medfield had a second hat factory, and that was on South Street. And that second hat factory, known as the New England Straw Works, originally was owned by Warren Chenery. And then later Jeremiah Hale has ownership of that, and it becomes known for its high quality of hats that are produced right down here on South Street. Unfortunately, in 1979, it burns to the ground, and we lose it. And he then goes and he works now, becomes plant manager at the North Street hat factory. So he moves from one to the other. But when Town Hall burnt down, and this is why I make note of him, particularly in 1874, our town hall burns down. We lose a lot of our records. And what he does, because there was no Xerox machines and stuff, he hand copies, recopies all our old records. So if you go down to our town hall today and you go back and you look at a lot of those original records, he had beautiful penmanship. That's all. He hand copied all our records over, and that was Jeremiah Hale. He's kind of who's who in Medfield. He's a selectman, he's a representative, he's on the cemetery committee, he's town clerk, he's on the school committee. So there's a great story with him. people may associate with this a little bit. As you know, right in the downtown section of Medfield is that traffic box with the dog painted on, Jack the dog. Well, that actually was painted by John A.S. Monks. And I have a great chapter on monks in there. He becomes known as Sheep's Monks because he becomes a specialist in the etching and painting of sheep. Now this guy goes extreme. He goes up into northern Vermont, spends a winter with sheep herders living in a farm up in northern Vermont. He spends a summer in northern Maine, working as like a herder, taking care of sheep. He actually goes to the Alps, and he spends time in the Alps with the sheep up in the mountain, so that he specializes in paintings of sheep and animals. And I think I told last time the story of Jack the dog and Colonel Mitchell, but the reason that painting is there is because he ends up building the whole block that anchors Medfield Center today, we call Monk's Block, where Royal Pizza is, that area.
Wow.
And because he did the painting and he lived across the street, that's why the picture of Jack the dog is on that location there.
Well, what I want to do now is discuss the book, second running, where to find it, the price, you, what you're doing, because that book has more interesting history. And I'm not the only one that have said this. People that have bought it and read it. And that's why this is the second sequence. And I'd like to have you go ahead accordingly regarding the book, and what you're doing and how it looks.
Well, they look.
And the number of copies, my Lord, over 1,000 copies have been sold already.
We've sold a little over 2,000 copies. I must say a lot of that is because of the availability of Park Street Books. So the book is available and for sale at Park Street Books. And as I said before, if anyone would like it, the cost is $13.77. It sounds like an odd amount, but that's because of the sales tax. But if they want to send a check made out to this whole town, and they want to send it to my address, which is, I think we'll put this up on the screen, but it's 13 Lawrence Circle here in Medfield. If you live here in Medfield, at no cost, I'll even personally deliver it to your door. If you live outside of Medfield, the costs rise up to $15.75, and that's because of shipping and delivery. And again, just send me a check for that amount made out to this whole town in 13 Lawrence Circle here in Medfield, and I'll mail that to you. So they can either get it at Park Street Books, or they can mail me a check, and I'll send that to them, and they get a copy of it. And we'll have it for sale also on Medfield Day. The Medfield High School Alumni Association will have a booth. We'll have that for sale. I'll also make note that you can also get it at the Medfield Historical Society, which is open Saturdays from 10 to 12, or Medfield Historical Society at Medfield Day will have it for sale at their booth also.
Situations have come up that I chat with people, two in particular. We were sitting having coffee, and he came up with a question, and I know that we get quite an answer. He said, you know, the background of Mr. DeSorgher is something else, but how does he have the ability to memorize all of the areas in which he is covered? And I know that he has that article in the Hometown Weekly, but a memory of the beginning actually of Medfield right up to the present. And I said, well, when I see Richard, I'll ask him, because, and he looked at, and the other gentleman said to me, Bob said to me, he's got a memory and a half, but he's got a plate full. I know he's a selectman, he's a town historian, but all the knowledge that he has relative to Medfield is astounding.
Well, that memory is going fast. I'm not as good as I used to be. Part of that, when I first started out teaching, I was in the middle school, and I wanted to tie in local history because I thought kids could more relate to the bigger picture of history. And I started a research project where kids actually selected using Tilden's genealogy into Tilden's history. And I would have them come down every Saturday down the Historical Society, and I had, well over 100 students. So I did this for about 13 years. So every Saturday I'd be down there, and the kids would come in, and so I was doing the research, and it just kept being reinforced, that after a while it was like I knew the people in Tilden's genealogy, that I knew other people. I knew where they lived, their family members, because I kept working with the kids over and over, and so then it becomes like, ingrained in your memory of where they lived and what they did. So that was a big help. Just working when I was a middle school teacher, every Saturday we went from like September to January. And then I had to read all the reports and grade them. So a lot of that of those earlier years before 1900, it's just because I had just gone over it so much. And then it's fun writing the weekly article and I try very hard to always get a different article so I'm not repeating. And that forces me to do research, and it's like being a detective. It's fun. You find new information and you reinforce the history. So it's fun.
Richard, we were sitting talking about ability, memory, and so forth. Well, a lady must have been listening to us because she was right by. And she interrupted. She said, well, I rode on the bus, and that gentleman seems to know every one of those houses and the history of those houses. How?
Well, on the houses, I've done a lot of work on that. The Historic District Committee has done a good job trying to form historic districts in town, and they've asked me to do some of the research. So, for example, East Main Street, which to me is one of the most historic areas in town, running from Clark Tavern, the Peak House, down to into the center of town. So I did a lot of work of researching all those houses. Because if it ever becomes an historic district, you have to prove that the district and the houses have that historical background. So I was able to do a lot of research on that to give the evidence to prove that it indeed has a lot of history. Like the Clark Tavern come up that Nathan Hale once stayed there. I mean, facts like that descend that Clark Tavern beyond important to Medfield, now puts it in a national view as well. So a lot of that is research I've done for the Historic District Commission, and a lot of times if a developer is going to tear down a house, and I've battled a lot of those, to speak before the Historical Commission, who has the ability to put the demolition delay bylaw on, but you have to prove that it has historic value. So I have to do my homework. When I testify or go to that hearing, I have to have my information, and so it forces me to go back through the assessor's office. I spent a lot of time going over to the Registry of Deeds over in Dedham, and great job. You can trace back, the whole history of that house through the ownership. So by doing that, that gives me a lot of information just on the history of the houses. And then I've been doing the trolley tours for some 22 years now, and to plot out that, again, I have to have my information, so I research that so that I have my facts correct onto that. But time for one quick story. A number of years ago, we did one of the trolley tours on houses that have been moved in Medfield. And so when I'm sitting up there, I'm saying, I could be almost telling these people anything. How do they know the information? So I really want to make sure my facts are right. So coming down, and it's amazing the number of houses that have been moved, but coming down Main Street where Monk's Block is, that huge building that anchors the center of town where Royal Pizza is. In a very serious voice, I said, if you see Monk's Block, which is huge, I said, originally that was located in Fairbanks, Alaska, and they brought it down by dog sled to Medfield. And the people sitting there saying, wow. I said, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. There's no way you could have brought that down by your dog sled. So I have to make sure I have my information correct.
You know, actually, my conversations with Richard go back a few years. But the most important factor, if you do not have that book, I would suggest that you buy it because of the fact that there is where history abounds. Secondly, a past master and historian has written it, and it's factual. Anything you'd like to add before we say goodnight?
No, again, I'm actually going to put together, because I have the stories already done over the past 10 years of stories, I'm going to put together another 70, 75 stories of a follow-up to this. I'll still call it This Old Medfield with a second, instead of being Remembering Medfield, I'll have a new title. I'm not sure what that will be. So hopefully before Christmas time, that will come out with a second one. And I'm still working on, which has taken me a long time, the upgrade of the history of Medfield. We did several series on that, which ends, the one I did ended in 1925. So the one I've been working on for a number of years now, take it from 1926 to 1955. So I continue to work on that and I just did some interviews last week on a number of people in that time period. So I'm still working on a couple more. So this will be available through Medfield Day, and then sometime before Christmas we'll come out with a second volume of it.
I'm going to keep that in mind. That's the first one, and very, very interesting, because situations that exist, you put that book down, I guarantee you pick it back up and you won't stop until you read it. Richard, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
This is Jack Peterson wishing you and yours the very best. Good night.
Possible through the generous support of your Medfield friends and neighbors, folks just like you. And thanks for watching.